Well, welcome all. My name is Seth Green, and on an afternoon like this one, I'm especially grateful to say I'm the dean here at the University of Chicago Graham School. And we are thrilled to have Eric Schurenberg with us to talk again about media and trust, this time focused on polarization in a post-truth era. This is a continuing series that we've been involved in with Eric in the lead up to his course that will be taught this summer on media, trust, and the 2024 elections. And the next event, just to preview it, after this will feature a discussion between Eric and Marty Baron, who is the former executive editor of the Washington Post and has a really important book that recently came out. And that one will be in person in the University of Chicago Fleischer Center. Eric Schurenberg is a longtime business journalist and media executive, now the founder of the Alliance for Trust in Media, a nonprofit organization devoted to building a relationship of trust and recognition between journalists and their audience. Before starting the Alliance, Eric held several leadership roles in journalism, most recently as the CEO of Mansueto Ventures, the home of the iconic business media brands Inc. and Fast Company. Most important to me, we are grateful to call Eric a distinguished instructor of journalism here at the University of Chicago Graham School. And so with that, Eric, I'm going to turn it over to you. Eric's going to talk for about 20 to 25 minutes. I'll have some questions after that, and then we will engage all of your questions. Though you should not wait. If you have questions as his presentation goes on, please just put them in the chat. I'll be keeping track of them and then make sure to weave them into our conversation. And with that, Eric, let me turn it over to you. And the slides actually came down, so if you want to put them back up, or I can when you have a moment. But yeah, turn it over to you, and you're on mute, but we are in suspense. Let's see. I think you've got the camera. There we go. Perfect. Now we hear you. Perfect.
I love to build suspense.
Yes.
So I will. I'll share my screen now, and let's see if that guesses where we want to be. All right, Seth, how's that look?
It looks perfect. We can't wait.
All right. Thank you, Seth, and thank you to everyone who's here to join this conversation about trust and polarization and the media. I would like to start this conversation with a quote. In an ever-changing, incomprehensible world, the masses had reached the point where they would, at the same time, believe everything and nothing, think that everything they were told was possible, and that nothing they were told was true. The political philosopher Hannah Arendt wrote that in 1951, describing the information environment in the Soviet Union. Now, I wonder what she would say if she knew, as many of us learned on Monday, that 1 in 5 Americans believe that Taylor Swift was part of a covert government plan to fix the Super Bowl. You would not be on this call if you didn't recognize that our information environment today is deeply challenged. So many news sources, so many contradictory realities, so hard to know what to believe. And just when you thought it couldn't get any worse, along comes AI. Now, I'm afraid that we won't be able to dissect the entire problem today over our lunch hour, but we can set some achievable goals. So success today means first that you come away with a little better understanding of how today's information ecosystem works, both in the outside world and inside your own head. And second, that you come away with a few skills to find your way to the truth despite it all. Let's agree on a few basics. First, that there are such things as objective truths, not your truths and my truths, not red truths and blue truths, just claims that are true, even if some people don't believe them. Let's also agree that none of us can uncover these truths all by ourselves. But there are institutions out there, science, law, academia, professional media, imperfect though it is, that work to uncover truth on our behalf. And finally, let's agree that getting to the truth is worth the journey. No one, Republican or Democrat, young or old, vaxxer or anti-vaxxer, wants to be played for a fool. When I do this, I do a longer version of this media literacy workshop for my corporate clients, I give it a different title, which is this: How to Be Nobody's Fool. So yes, I mean, it is highly desirable to be an informed adult and a good citizen and a truth seeker and all that. But bottom line, you don't want to be anybody's fool. Now let's dive into the meat of the conversation by breaking down this vast information ecosystem the same way advertising technologists do, into a supply side and a demand side. And here's a simplified representation of the supply side. 8 broad categories shown as these multi-bar clusters, with each bar showing the category's popularity with different age groups. Pre-digital era, there were just 4 of these clusters: local and national newspapers, network news, and radio. And now there are twice as many clusters, with social media being, as you can see, by far the most important for people under 35. Now, what this chart doesn't begin to capture is the amount of information emanating from each of these categories. There are vastly more podcasts than radio stations, vastly more YouTubers than TV news outlets. And ponder this: all told, there are maybe 85,000 journalists of all kinds in the US. Facebook alone has 3 billion active monthly users, and each of those 3 billion is a potential news source, creating posts or sharing things they've seen. 80 years before social media, James Joyce introduced the phrase, "Here comes everybody." He might have been describing your newsfeed today. The unimaginable volume of information is not the only fundamental barrier to finding trustworthy news today. Media's business model has been utterly overthrown, and that has had profound effects on the news you see. So let's talk about one part of that upended business model: advertising. Now, let's say that you're scrolling through Instagram and you see an ad for, say, Apple Watch. And you might think, oh, all right, Apple bought an ad on Instagram. Well, sort of, but not really. What almost certainly happened is this complicated thing you see below the dotted line there. As you scroll down Instagram, a message went out to a digital ad exchange. The exchange alerted supply side and demand side tech platforms saying, someone is about to view an ad. What am I bid for that person's attention? In our example, Apple ended up being the highest bidder, and so it got to serve you its ad. Now, this invisible auction and ad serving happen instantaneously, in tenths of seconds, faster than you can see. What doesn't happen is that the advertiser knows where its ads will appear. Will they be on Washington Post, on TikTok, or an ISIS recruiting site? The technology doesn't care. It cares only about getting ads to the right people wherever they may be online. Now that amounts to an earthquake in media business models. And here's the aftermath of that earthquake in 3 depressing numbers. An invasive species, social media, now dominates the ecosystem. 5 of every $8 spent on digital advertising goes to just 4 companies: Meta, which owns Facebook and Instagram; Alphabet, which owns Google and YouTube; Amazon, and TikTok. Professional media has to fight over the scraps that are left over. Local news has been hardest hit. 2,500 local news organizations have closed in recent years. We lose, on average, 2 newspapers a week. And even in the media that remains, newsrooms have been hollowed out. In 2020, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, there were 55% fewer jobs for reporters and columnists than 15 years earlier. 55%. And it's not getting better. 2024 is just 6 weeks old, and already you've read about layoffs at the LA Times, the Washington Post, CNN, Sports Illustrated, and many others. This is cataclysmic change, and it transforms not just how we get our news, it also changes the kind of news we get in 3 fundamental ways. First, there is just more falsehood. Because of programmatic advertising, you can make a good living just making stuff up and posting it online as long as it gets traffic. Most traffic is now on social media platforms, filtered through the algorithms that drive your feed. And those algorithms care only about keeping you on the site so the platform can show you more ads and earn more money. Truth or falsehood, just not the algorithm's concern. Generative AI is almost sure to make things worse. This image is a result of a campaign from last fall created by Iran's Revolutionary Guards to discredit Israel's prime minister by claiming his psychiatrist committed suicide. The Iranians used AI to create a fictional psychiatrist, create all sorts of details about his life and credentials and means of death. It took minutes, if not seconds, to create that false story, but it was plausible enough that it got picked up on Middle Eastern news sites like this one. Another change you may have noticed is more opinion. Newsrooms lost reporting staff, but they still have to generate content. And hiring a pundit to comment on news reported by somebody else is a lot cheaper than sending reporters to Ukraine, say, to generate original news. How many of you thought, as you watched the news recently, just for crying out loud, hold the opinions and just give me the friggin' facts? Well, you're not hallucinating. In 1955, about 85% of the stories on the front page of the New York Times and Washington Post were straight reported news. And by the beginning of this century, that number had jumped to 47%. In other words, the majority of front page news is now opinion or analysis. Now, there's nothing wrong with that, as long as the source makes it clear what you're reading, and as long as you recognize the difference. Now, here are 4 made-up headlines, all about basketball player Kyrie Irving's admitted belief that the Earth is flat. Now, I asked ChatGPT to generate these headlines, to generate one in the style of a New York Times news story, one in the style of a Times analysis piece, and one that might run on the opinion page. And finally, I asked it for one potential post on X from Elon Musk, which ChatGPT seemed to particularly enjoy writing. Now, can you identify which is news, which is analysis, which is opinion? The answer to distinguishing these 4 types of articles lies in understanding the intent of the creator. So if the creator of the story is telling you what happened and nothing more, that's news, obviously. Kyrie Irving sparks controversy. So either he sparks controversy or he doesn't. It's a true or false statement. In analysis, the creator aims to put context around the story. So the facts should be accurate, but the aim is to explain why the facts matter. A lens into the intersection of celebrity and pseudoscience. The creator hopefully is aiming to reveal a true connection between celebrities and pseudoscience, but there is an element of interpretation. If the creator aims to persuade you of their point of view, that's opinion, obviously. So Kyrie Irving saying, think for yourself, that's not a true or false statement. It's a judgment, a should or shouldn't argument, and you can agree with it or not. That kind of content should be labeled as opinion and ideally separated from the news. Not all news sites do that, though. And finally, social media commentary, which researchers tend to call gossip, categorize as gossip, because for all the technology trappings around it, it's really the most primitive form of information sharing we humans have, because it's not about truth or about advancing knowledge. It's about the relationship between the creator and the audience. It's a performance. So the message is, look how outraged I am, or what a good Democrat or Republican I am, or whatever. In this made up post from Elon, the message is, hey, I'm one of you, only quite a bit richer. It's us against fake science. The third, and maybe the most damaging effect of the supply side change, is more polarization. In the new ecosystem, traffic is money, and nothing drives traffic like outrage and fear. And a great way to stoke outrage and fear is to demonize those other people. Sad to say, the US media landscape is more polarized than that of comparable democracies like the UK and Germany, which both have robust, government-funded, nonpartisan news sources. As this graph shows, the most attended news sources in those two countries are the BBC and the ARD, respectively, which sit in the middle of political opinion. In the US, there is no media source in the middle, and the range of viewpoints is much wider, much more polarized. Now let's switch to the demand side. The demand side is us. Fake news spreads because we are all of us, vulnerable to it. See for yourself. These headlines are from the Misinformation Susceptibility test administered recently by the University of Cambridge. Can you identify the fake headlines of these five? Maybe, if you have something to write on, you can number a page 1 through 5 and write down your guess as R for real or F for fake as I read off the headlines. So younger Americans are the ones most worried about climate change. Number 2, US support for legal marijuana is steady. A study reveals that certain vaccines are loaded with dangerous toxins and chemicals. Or revealed, government is manipulating genetic engineering to make the public more approving of it. And finally, reflecting demographic shifts, 109 US counties have become majority non-white. So let's take a look. Turns out all of these headlines are true, except for those with the those two with the check marks next to them. So how did you do? On average, Americans were wrong a third of the time on this test, with some interesting differences within the group. Young people were more likely to be fooled than older ones. Republicans more likely to be fooled than Democrats. Big social media users more likely to be fooled than people who mainly got their news elsewhere. And just to bring this down to individual news platforms, Snapchat and Truth Social users did the worst on the test. AP and NPR users, the best. So why do people have such a hard time telling truth from falsehood? It's because of the way our brains are wired. Psychologists have identified and given jargony names to a whole battery of mental shortcuts and hardwired biases that make us susceptible to fake news. Now, in the interest of time, I'll drill down on just one of them, but I'm happy to cover these others during the Q&A if you like. So this screenshot captures how Tucker Carlson a few years ago exploited apophenia for a misleading news story. Apophenia is a fancy name for our brain's tendency to recognize patterns even where they don't exist. Now, the origin of this story was a small social media account where someone aggregated a bunch of regional news headlines about a dozen fires over the past 6 months at local food processing plants that made breakfast cereals, among other foods. Carlson brought on a reporter, that guy on the right, to say, hey, there have been a lot of fires at food processing plants in the past 6 months. That's suspicious, and Americans want to know what's going on here. Now, if there were serious truth-seeking editors on Tucker's team, they might have asked, well, how common are fires at food processing plants, and how suspicious were these fires in particular? If you asked, you'd learn that there are 300,000 food processing plants in the US, so that a few fires over 6 months isn't that unusual. And if you actually read the local news stories, you'd learn that far from burning the places down, most of the fires didn't even stop operations at the plants, and in no cases were the fires considered suspect. And finally, a good editor, or even a healthily skeptical viewer, might ponder the fundamental question here. Why would saboteurs travel the country to set fires in breakfast cereal plants? What was the nefarious purpose? Was someone really out to cripple our nation's strategic stockpile of Cap'n Crunch? Knowing the mental levers that misinformation sources try to pull, you can start to recognize some of the tells of false narratives. Sander van der Linden, a researcher at Cambridge, has come up with this list of red flags, which he gave the acronym of DEPICT. D is for discrediting, though often a false narrative will discourage you from checking sources that might contradict it. Falsehood might start by warning that the mainstream media or the government or science is corrupt. Don't trust those other voices. Trust only us. Emotionality. Manipulators want you in an emotional state because there your powers of reason are overwhelmed. Why do you suppose that QAnon revolves around alleged child abuse? It's because who can not get emotional when the safety of children is invoked? Third, polarization. You want to watch out for news that aims to create an us versus them mentality, triggering your negativity bias or tribal instincts. Here, the argument is that those others are not just your neighbors or fellow citizens who disagree, they're stupid or evil or traitorous. Impersonation. Go back to the talking head example on the Tucker Carlson food processing plant segment. That guy was not from Homeland Security. He was not even a fire marshal. He was a reporter who, as far as I could tell, had done nothing more than read the original misleading social media post and the trolling that amplified it. But his being there implied that, well, here's a reporter. He's on top of this. This must be news. Conspiratorial thinking. False narratives often rely on patterns, observing patterns that don't really exist, or the stories are illogical or internally contradictory, or they rely on familiar villains like George Soros or the Koch brothers. All of these things are earmarks of conspiracy theories. And finally, trolling as the final red flag. A lot of support for an online claim does not make it true. By some measures, bots account for 47% of social media traffic. That Tucker Carlson talking head implied that the fires must be suspicious because so many people were sharing that post. But chances are the people supporting that post were not even people. All right, so let's take stock. At this point, you know a couple of things. You know that you are vulnerable to falsehood because you're human and you have a human brain. And you know enough red flags to know when to be suspicious. So what do you do with that knowledge? Well, I'll tell you what I'd recommend after 30 years as a journalist and a media CEO trying to decide when my reporters really had a story or when they were being spun. So first, Take your emotions out of it. Emotions make a claim more powerful, but they don't make it true. Don't waste your precious credence until you've had a chance to calmly reflect. Second, get a second opinion, get a third opinion. Nobel Prize winner Daniel Kahneman points out that the root cause of many errors of judgment stem from the mental shortcut he calls by the acronym WYSIATI. What you see is all there is. The headline in front of you, the post in front of you, the talking head in front of you is not all there is. See what other sources are saying. Third, friction costs. Judge what's at stake for the entity making a claim. Now, I'm more likely to believe a Wall Street Journal investigative story than an anonymous claim on 4chan. Sources like the Journal have standards. They have a reputation to uphold. What does a 4chan poster have to lose? By the same token, believe sworn testimony over PR statements, believe on the record sources over anonymous ones, believe people taking a risk to make a claim, like by breaking with their tribal dogma, over people who are simply towing the party line. And finally, if you take nothing away from this conversation, take this away. Admit that you don't know. Admit that you have biases that may slant your perception. Get outside your bubble to get a different perspective. Don't imagine that you or your group have a monopoly on truth. And now, a final word about trust, that element that is in such short supply today. You need it. You can't learn anything outside your own field of vision if you don't have trust. So your job in this crazy, disrupted universe is to identify sources worthy of your trust. Give trust, but give it provisionally, willing to change your mind if the facts change, and don't give it cheap. But if you do that, you'll be an informed citizen. You'll be a registered member of the reality-based community. Then, most important of all, you'll be nobody's fool. No, thank you.
Thank you, Eric, for what was a very powerful presentation, and a presentation that sparked many comments and questions in the chat. And so I want to use the remaining time that we have to converse with you about them. And if you're able to take your screen down, we'll see you in full picture here. I can also
I will, Seth, I'll do that in a second. Let me put up
your
my
contact
slide for my not-for-profit company in the disinformation field. It's called the Alliance for Trust in Media. Feel free to get in touch with me at that email there. I think about this topic night and day, and I would love to discuss it with anyone. And please follow my podcast, which is called In Reality, and you can find it on anywhere you listen to podcasts. All right, so Seth, I'm taking down my screen, and let's
Wonderful.
talk.
Well, as you come into full view, I want to start with a series of questions that have come into the chat around how you think about the policy environment. So you've given us really excellent tips as individuals on how we can be better navigators of information. But many are asking questions about what Congress should be doing, in your view, on a couple of levels. One is on the social media level, and the model that you laid out of how money in dominant institutions like a Google is playing out, and how that shapes the whole marketplace. And I know there is a DOJ investigation as an example. And then the other is around how policy might shape support for the media environment, public broadcasting and those types. So a big picture question with multiple strands here. How do you think about policy and what role it can play in helping to counter some of these challenging forces?
Okay. Well, let me talk first about social media and reducing some of the harms that we know it has caused and is responsible for. Obviously, there's not a lot of support for regulation of any kind in the current Congress. And if there is anything where there may be bipartisan support, it is in reducing harms to children through social media. And that may gain some traction, but it's probably not going to help clean up the information environment. What does seem to be helping and is focused on that, achieving that goal, is regulation that's coming out of the EU right now. So there is a law that is going into effect right about now called the Digital Services Act. And what it does is clever because it doesn't get involved in government. It doesn't require government to get involved in deciding what is true or false. Instead, it just insists on transparency for social media platforms that are large enough so that users can understand what the content moderation policy is at that company, and so make informed decisions about which platform they want to be on. It requires the companies to report on how they enforce their content moderation policies, which has been historically something that there's been a real bone of contention. Companies will say that they do this, but their enforcement is very spotty. And also, they require the companies to share their data with researchers so that we can understand better what goes on behind the black box of algorithms. Um, Hopefully, this will bleed over into the US because the social media platforms are all international companies and they might as well, hopefully, follow the rules in the US that they follow in the EU, or at least we can learn from the experience in the EU. As far as government enforcing help for traditional media companies, I I think that some of the efforts that are taking place in places like Canada and Australia, where Facebook and Google are required to compensate media companies for the information they use, I think that's it's not as straightforward as you like. And I have real concerns that what is going to happen here is a vast series of unintended consequences in which major national news platforms get a lot of support. I don't think that the idea behind any of these laws is to support, um, Fox News or, major platforms like the New York Times, but that's what will happen, and local news will continue to be starved. I do think that as a national priority, it would be very helpful for the US to follow the lead of the UK and Germany and have government funded information sources that are pledged to be nonpartisan, that don't have to worry about their business models and whether they're attracting advertisers or subscribers, which can sort of twist and provide perverse incentives and twist the editorial perspective. And I would love to see that. Whether that could ever happen in the US is right now hard to imagine. But I think that in the interests of cleaning up the information environment, something like that, it seems to be the most straightforward path.
And can I ask a follow-up on that, Eric? Because when we
Mhm.
look back to the graph that you presented, it showed that the BBC, for example, was right at the center with a big circle.
Mhm.
I believe NPR was over toward the left side in the US example, and also much smaller as a source of news comparatively.
Mhm.
Is your sense that one of the reasons that it may be further left is because of the subscriber model, which I believe to be more dominant in the NPR finances or public television here than in the BBC example where they get more of their money from government? Is that a fair
Yes.
way to think about influence of a subscriber model, that NPR has more need in their business model to appeal to subscribers, which statistically I know to be a left of center audience or further than that?
Yes, that is important. Also, donors who are not necessarily subscribers, but maybe big ticket donors, also have an influence that isn't part of the conversation at the BBC or in German government funded sources. Also, NPR is less it's useful to think of it not so much as a kind of monolithic newsroom like the
Right.
BBC, but as many different local newsrooms aggregated together. So you have a variety of um, producers. I mean, some of the big producers are um, WGBH or Minnesota Public Radio, and often those originate in places where the audience is left-leaning compared to the country.
A follow-up question that comes from Bev is in that graph, you did show that in the US, there are some small circles in the center, even though the big places are on the ends. What are some of the news sources, Bev wants to know, that are closer to the center in the US that if you were advising people to use maybe as a core source of information, they might look to? What were some of those small circles, so to speak, in your graph?
I would be happy to actually put up a slide where I attempted to answer that question, if you like, Seth.
Sure.
And if we want to take a quick diversion into sort of what I would recommend you put in your news feed, I'd be happy to do that. So here,
Yeah, please.
let me do that. So the answer to this particular question is this column on the right. So these are news sources that, in my opinion, do a very good um, job of keeping their opinion out of their news and distinguishing between news and opinion. So Reuters and AP, I wouldn't be, all those small circles in the US were not identified. I think that AP would probably be one of them. Um, groundnews.com is an interesting example. It is a news aggregator. It's based in Toronto, aggregates news from around the world. And what you see when you subscribe to Ground News is various news organizations' take on the news of the day. So it could be sort of the India Times take on um, the 2024 election in the US. But for each of those headlines, you get a graph that shows you how much of the reporting on that story is from left-leaning news sources, right-leaning news sources, or centrist sources. And you see how different the news environment is for people depending on their political leaning. That there are stories that right-leaning news sources ignore. There are stories that they cover enthusiastically and left-leaning sources ignore. That's a very interesting perspective on what the whole news environment would be. What this chart also shows are places to go to double check facts. So when a rumor reaches you, chances are it has also reached one of these organizations like Snopes or Fact Check or PolitiFact. And you can see what they have said about it and whether they've dug down into it. And among other things, it's very interesting to see where rumors originate. And if you don't mind, I'll go further into the question of friction costs. So the columnists on the left are all writers who, for the most part, with some exceptions, are, and this is obviously highly opinionated for me, these are people who generally are to the right of my political stance. But in each case, they have taken a risk. They stand apart from the dogma of, conservative dogma as it's now understood. And to me, that kind of independent thinking gives them credibility. They have friction costs. They have broken with their tribe. Um, and and two I'll single out in particular. One is Isaac Saul, who has a newsletter called Tangle, a Substack newsletter. And what's interesting about Saul is not just his independent thinking, but that the way he presents news. He takes a story that is, getting a lot of public attention at the moment. He gives 3 examples from the left, 3 examples from the right in opinion about that news story. All of them are rendered respectfully. There is no attempt to mock or undercut any of those opinions. And then he gives his own take. That model has been replicated in a much weaker form by Semaphore, which is a commercial online-only news site. And at the bottom is Lena Wen, who is a healthcare columnist for the Washington Post. And what has given me a particular faith in her is I've observed how she has broken with the sort of the progressive wing of the medical establishment and also the conservative wing of the medical establishment, and has taken quite a few blows because of it, because she has the courage of her convictions, and her convictions seem to be based entirely on medical research. I have a lot of faith in her. These on the right, as you can see, are about media literacy and ways to sharpen your skills at getting to the truth in a complicated news environment. So I'll stop sharing right now.
So, Eric, one of the graphs that fascinated me was seeing where people are getting their information from, and the huge increase as we get into the younger generation in social media being the main form of information.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing that struck me is that we are today in an environment where many people, especially those that are 50 plus, grew up with facts as the core, and then it evolved. And so when you come into that demand side, there is a group that was conditioned to think about facts as the core of news and to still be searching for it. And so that has some accountability mechanism on what's out there. What happens as we get into a world where the people that are now with social media as their main form of news, so that is their literal conception, their foundation of news, as they now become adults and become the, both writers of news, I mean, because they're now becoming the people that are editing and publishing, and they're going to be taking over obviously the media industry, but also they're the consumers. How do you see this playing out? And, how do you see roles in education to try to counter this? Because it strikes me that as much as we see this as a problem now, if we project forward on what it looks like for generations who have only really seen social media as a form of news, it strikes me that it gets much worse without some kind of educational intervention. So I'm just curious kind of how you see that, and what role education could play.
Well, that trend worries me too, Seth. And I saw it in my own newsroom at Ink and Fast Company, where the younger journalists were much more oriented towards being advocates for their particular point of view and needed to be steered back towards the kind of remove that you need to be a objective journalist. So that is definitely the orientation of people coming out of colleges these days. There are educational efforts underway. Illinois, for example, has just embraced a resolution to teach critical thinking and media literacy in the school systems. And in so doing, Illinois joins a dozen other states. But that is still a minority view, and it needs to be taught. I think that in the end, the thing that will bring people back is the sense that not being attached to factual reality is kind of dysfunctional, and you don't understand how things work, and you will be at a disadvantage. And the most striking and tragic result of this, as we saw during COVID, was how many COVID deniers, or how much more likely COVID deniers were to be seriously ill or die of COVID because they had been led down a misinformation path. That kind of thing is the sort of thing that will bring people back. But I agree that there is a strong generational divide, and that accounts for, among other things, the difference between younger test takers in that Cambridge misinformation susceptibility test between younger test takers and older test takers.
Well, so we are at time, Eric, but I want to ask this final question because, hearing your presentation is sobering and brilliant, but not immediately evoking optimism. So I want to end on that note. What's one reason that you are optimistic or hopeful? One positive sign that you're seeing amidst the changes that are taking place that gives you a sense that we might have some counter currents that will be successful to what's taking place?
There are two. One is that it has been demonstrated by research that the most effective way to keep people out of misinformation rabbit holes is to give them the skills to recognize when they're being manipulated. Media literacy training, which is something that I do for corporations with the Alliance for Trust in Media, is an effective tool. And that is the kind of thing that leaders of school districts are picking up on and bringing into their schools, we just mentioned, in Illinois and other places. And the other thing is what I mentioned as kind of the aside in this presentation is that people do not want to be anybody's fool, and they don't want to be tricked. So people who believe things that you think are crazy don't think it's crazy. They think it is that they've just done more research or they have insight that you don't have. But when they talk about it, they don't say, I prefer to believe in superstition. I prefer to believe in nonsense because I think nonsense is better. What they say is, I'm following the science. I'm following the facts. I'm doing my research. People have a sense of that these tools of research and science and so forth are the things that will lead them to truth. They just need to know how to use the tools.
Well, Eric, this has been a fascinating conversation. I'm hopeful because you are leading an effort to try to restore trust in journalism that we desperately need more of in this era. And I'm also excited that we're going to be continuing this conversation with you as you interview Marty Baron on the 13th of March at the Gleacher Center. And all of you should join us, should you be available then. And so looking forward to continuing the conversation then and to your class this summer. Thank you all for being here and for being part of our intellectual community. We hope to be a place where we are able both to have deep commitment to facts and also to critical thinking and to the ability to actually hear competing views and see that as a real positive as we come to our own discernment. Have good afternoons, everyone.
Thank you, Seth.